All right, good evening. We will come to our last parenting class here, which means that you guys are totally ready to go off and parent. Don't need any more of our help. No, it's so many things still we can just keep covering, and it's just the opportunity to keep drawing out more principles and thinking through things. But I hope that this time is an opportunity for us to think carefully about what we're doing and just think practically about how we're shepherding our kids and parenting them and encouraging them. There are a couple burdens that have been on my own heart as I've watched parenting, and I wanted to use this time to encourage it. I particularly have seen families that have been let's say they have great moral principles, great commitment to the church, great desire to be, studying the Bible and a great love for Christ. But it seems to stop there at an outward expression of love and appreciation. The actual practice of walking in the truth, confronting their own heart when they've been rebellious or sinful, their own fears going to war against them, their own idols, they just kind of keep pushing those things aside. And I've wanted to kind of expose that. I wanted to kind of get the mirror out and say, look, this would be unrighteous to act this way, and it's going to have effects. And the area it comes out is in our kids. Our kids watch our lives, from the moment they wake up, the moment they go to bed, and sometimes in the middle of the night when they wake you up from sleeping, they are watching your life. They see how you respond to the difficulties and pressures. They watch you in the car heading to church and back. They observe all of those details and how you respond in those details, how you respond to the pressures, how you respond to the conflict, how you respond to, somebody mistreating you. All of that they are watching, and we are living out our examples before them. And, it's true that oftentimes when the Old Testament talked about the sins of the fathers are, upon the second and third generation, the idea isn't that, well, if I sin, the consequences fall on my family. The idea is that there is examples that kids learn, and it just gets passed on. So, you hear the old adage, well, I'm angry because I'm Irish. It's just part of my Irish roots, therefore that's why I'm angry. Well, yeah, you might be inclined because of certain hereditary factors, but you learn patterns and behaviors. You learn responses, and if your home is the kind of home that speaks at a loud volume and you think, hey, this is what normal communication is, you're going to carry over those patterns on down the line. And it does come out in the home, particularly where we have certain behaviors and practices that we carry out and certain sins that become acceptable. In fact, there's a book by one of the Tripp brothers called Acceptable Sins, and it's the idea that there are just certain sins and behaviors that we just tolerate and we overlook. And so the concern is that as parents, we carry on certain sins into our parenting and we overlook them, and they just become part of our practice. And when that happens, it's going to start to have effect on the kids, and particularly what will be affected in the kids. They will either be provoked to anger or exasperated. They will be pushed to despair, exasperation. They become hopeless, or they'll be provoked, enticed towards anger. And what gets confusing in the whole process is what the parent is doing to add to it. And that's what I want to give you insight in. Your kid isn't going to sit there and say, Mom, let me help you assess your heart. Here's where you are not responding to the truth, and here's where you're responding in fear and idolatry. I mean, even if they did, you wouldn't want to hear it at the moment. They're not going to be able to tactfully think through that, understand the issue, and point it out to you. So you have to do that evaluation. And I would say, first of all, fathers, this has to be on your radar. You have to be thinking about it and protecting your home. Because if your home is spinning out of control because either you or your wife are not winning these battles, it's on the dad who's going to have to give a responsibility and account to the Lord about how he shepherded his family. But it goes beyond. Both parents need to recognize, what am I doing that would add to the difficulties that would cause my child to stumble and find it difficult to come under truth and practice truth. And so I wanted to use this kind of final hour that we have together to highlight some of those things and draw them out for you so that you can be careful as you shepherd your kids through these difficulties. I just, again, I'm grieved by the teen years and beyond, when teens just become hardened. They don't want to hear anything. They push away. Parents lose influence in the kids' lives, and they're hopeless. And the parent is coming into our offices and they're hopeless, wondering, what can we do? And what you have is a lifetime of rejecting truth, not applying it in your own heart, expecting the kids to come under it while you lived outside of it, and they're just dealing with the hypocrisy of it all, and they don't want to listen. Look, the sin in the kid's heart is hard enough to deal with. Added the extra layer of a parental hypocrisy, or parents obtuse to the ways that they're adding extra pressure, and it just gets confusing and hopeless. And if I could do everything I can to help you not go down that track, that's my hope in this time. Introductory thoughts, questions on that as I jump into the text here, what that might look like, or any concerns that you say, yeah, how would I identify those things? Yeah.
How would I identify those things?
Great question. Let's look at our text here. There's the two passages that we're thinking about are Ephesians 6:4, which says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." And Colossians 3:21, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children, that they may not lose heart." Two things that we're looking for in our kids. It's, am I provoking them to an angry response, or am I leading them to hopelessness and despair? Listen, today, it just happened today. It just seemed like in God's good providence, he wanted to bring on my youngest child roadblocks at every step. He wanted one thing for lunch, and it was no longer there. And then he wanted one thing to watch on TV, and we wouldn't let him do that. And then he went outside to go work, to go play something, and he lost the ball that he wanted to play with. And it was just like one closed door after another, and you could just see the despair level, or the anger level stacking up. So to the point which then my wife gave him an instruction. His heart was ready just to explode, because here he was asked to do a chore, and he didn't want to do it, and so as he's just giving his sinful response to the pressures of life, it's at that moment a wise parent assesses and sees what's happening here. Says, all right, in this case, his son, you need to go sit in your room, calm down, think about what's going on, and then come back and talk to me. And then we're going to work through it together. That's disarming it, even when you're seeing these pressures add up in their life. There's a sense that what we're looking for in our kids, am I getting into this battle where we're going to go to war, a clash of wills, or am I pushing them to a point where they're about to just get despairing and have no hope and think they can't accomplish anything? That would be error on both sides, and we are to guard against that. I always kind of chuckled because in life watching my kids grow up, because it would be those conflicts where all of a sudden one of the kids had their will crossed and they would start to express it. Outrage, crying, fits, throwing themselves down. We had one child who was a master at this at 3 years old, that when she did not get what she wanted, she would pull her hair and throw herself to the ground. And I would think, that's a great wrestling move, but it's hurting you more than me. But it was a demonstration on her part to try to control the circumstance and situation as their anger was burning up. Now, as a parent, we got to work through that in a way that's wise, in a way that's encouraging, exhorting, and not adding more fuel to that fire. Because we could see that and we can match it, and that would be inappropriate. We could come along and correct that behavior and confront it as we have to do, but we want to make sure we're not doing what Ephesians 6:4 says, that we're provoking it, we're exciting it, we're stimulating the anger. So there is assessment as we look at a difficult situation. If we see them heading towards anger, our first assessment is, am I doing anything to add to this? Or am I doing something to wisely disarm this and help get to the heart issue? Now listen, you don't have to address the issue immediately. You can first disarm the conflict, get them in a state of self-control, get the issue, the immediate presentation problem solved, and then you can circle the wagons back and address the hard issue of what's going on. And that just takes warning and patience. Warning as for our parents, understanding what's happening, and patience to endure through the difficulty so that you can make sure the heart is being dealt with. What I, would want to encourage you parents is to realize that, that change oftentimes comes very slow. I mean, I don't have to convince you this in sanctification. You know this. You know this from your own personal battles. You know this in your own personal lives. At times, certain things come very slow. So that even the expectation for our kids is that awareness. It's going to be slow. It's going to be steady. There might be a day of great, excellence where they've got everything in order, and then the next day they seem to get like amnesia and forget everything you taught them. But you're not reacting to those things. You're just going back and, again, setting the line and reminding them. So this first sense then for a parent is we are working to make sure that we're doing nothing to add to or provoke the child to head into that anger. And the kind of anger here then is just the rage against against the rules, rage against you, against the command. It's like, no, we're not going to stimulate those things. We're going to try to disarm them. And sometimes a kid has spun so far out of control, the only way to disarm it is saying, I'm just going to put you here in your room, take away these items that you enjoy, and let you, calm down, and then we're going to come back and talk about this and work it out. I've never been in the fan of, well, you're going to get angry, physically violent, so I'm going to match you. I've never been a fan of that. I've always you're gonna be destructive. You're gonna be destructive by yourself there, and there will be consequences for all that behavior. So you're gonna want to guard your heart and work and remember that the Lord sees these things, and that it is my responsibility as a dad to hold you accountable for your actions, and I will. And so just giving them those warnings as they temper down and they get prepared to embrace the challenges that they have. One other thing that, again, in exasperating, what's taking place is that you have crushed their spirit. You crush their ability or their will to move on or move forward. You've created either such a high standard, a demand, they just feel like they can't accomplish it. And it's hard in those moments to distinguish between despair and laziness because they look the same. When you see a child who's lazy, I just can't pick up this toy, is it truly despair or is it laziness? Well, it's like, son, can you hold this football that's heavier than that? Yes, I can hold that. Well, then now it's laziness. It's not despair. You have the ability. It's moved into this laziness. So as a parent, we're drawing out the heart to distinguish, is this truly despair that you've created such a standard it's impossible and they've lost hope, or is it laziness? Is it selfishness on their part of unwillingness to come under the truth? Our objective as a parent is to work and draw out to say, am I doing anything that could despair? And this is where I think it's important for parents to learn how to be active influences in godly speech, by which I mean that we are regular encouragers. We encourage good behavior. We praise it. We give thanks for it. We rejoice in it. We draw attention to it when we see it. We applaud it in the sense of saying this is a good thing. It's a good thing to walk in this way. We acknowledge when they were doing right, they did it without you having to tell them, saying, that was a mature practice on your part, and we encourage them in those moments. We don't recognize it. It's in those times, it's that affirmation and encouragement that gives the child a sense of identity, where they know the boundaries. And they're encouraged by that. I know theologically that some say, well, you can't go around and encourage anybody because you're taking away their crown in heaven. If you go around and you give them praise, then they've lost eternal rewards. And if they're seeking my praise, yes. But if I give it, it's in addition to whatever the Lord is going to do. If I am giving simply out of the overflow of my love and appreciation, that is just part and parcel of all that the Lord would pour out on faithfulness, earthly rewards and heavenly rewards. So the issue of whether or not they lose their reward in heaven has nothing to do with you as the gift giver. It has everything to do with the receiver and what they seek after. That's why the Pharisees had sought the approval of men and why they had their reward in full. But not for the righteous. The righteous desire to glorify God and obey Him. And if there are earthly rewards and heavenly rewards as a result, then that's in God's hand. So when we as parents are thinking about this, we are looking at how do I encourage my kids to be faithful, and what can I do to praise them when they do well and exhort them when they get out of line. And that's actively what we're thinking about as parents when we're shepherding our parents. And so that I have here kind of a list of areas or ways that we can err and exasperate or provoke our kids to anger. But before I jump into that list, any questions or comments that you might have? Hi, David.
I would say, the biggest struggle is there you hit on it. It's having the patience in those situations to assess and help them pull down rather than just going in for the...
Yeah, so the biggest struggle often is we don't have enough patience to get an assessment of what's taking place. It's like, I've seen this one before, I'm going to jump in and quickly solve it. And spirals. I often think to myself, we have one teen in the house, we don't need me acting like a teen. It's just, I'll let them be the teen, I'm going to act above it. And, and sometimes I've had to encourage my wife, look, we can't expect them to get godly and then we come and match it. It's the other way around. We're going to be the example, and then we are going to call our kids to come in it. And I just know from practice, I can't give any ground. I can't lose any credibility, and so I don't want to give them anything in my response that would give them credibility to continue to, act in a sinful way. So it means if I've done wrong, I need to confess, I need to repent, I need to acknowledge it and seek to repent of that and seek forgiveness. And obviously, if the best is I be careful, slow, deliberate in response so that we can minister to them faithfully. You can say? Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned a little bit about the difficulty in determining if children are despairing or if they're being lazy. Is there maybe a couple things that come to mind on if this is how they're responding or if this is what they're saying? I know I'm provoking them or they're despairing.
Yeah, so some more signs for despairing and hopelessness. Yeah, so things like, I can't do it, Dad. The tears of, there are certain fears that may keep them from doing things. Like fear of man is a huge one. So it's like if a kid sees that they have to do something in front of their friends, all of a sudden you've asked them to do it, and they're just so intimidated about going around and doing something they're capable of doing. That's where despair will start to come out, and it'll be, I can't. And you're like, what do you mean you can't? It doesn't make any sense. Well, getting the assessment of what's happening, and part of this, again, is learning your child. Is your child prone to fear man? Is your child prone to seek the approval of others, or prone to certain fears of any kind, threats? Just knowing their personal makeup and what they struggle with helps you begin to think about the scenario and the situation. So listening for language of I can't would be hopelessness. Thinking, what's the value? The doubts of what good could come out of this. Those kinds of comments. Even the issues of fairness tend to come out in this. It's not fair, I have to do this, but then someone else has to do it. That is in despairing. Why would I have to labor like this, but someone else not? So those are things that you just be looking for here. Say, the net effect is you're not doing what I asked you to do, but there may be other causes in there that you have to hurdle to get them to a point which they would righteously come and seek to do what they've been asked to do. So there have been times where we've asked a kid to do something, but because of fear of men or whatever, and it wasn't so critical that it happened at that second, that we delayed obedience, saying, okay, wait for this event to pass and then you can go do it. If I could, as a parent, work in a way that allow them to do that issue at a later time and not force the issue of the fear of men or whatever they were struggling with, we would do that. It's not that it can happen all the time, but if it was possible, as a parent, I'd seek to do that. But I would also file that away and recognize, okay, my child has this strong fear of man in this area, or whatever the issue is, and I would find another way to address it or another time to bring it up. So the keys there is being able to take a moment to actually assess what's happening. And here's the difficulty for us. We get kids, we get the little ones that come in the world, and their life is just pretty simple. They're little ones, and we kind of like that stage. We like the stage of just being able to identify the physical needs. You need sleep, you need a diaper change, you need food, you need some playtime. Okay, you need to go to bed. Great, I can master that. Well, you carry that into the kids get older and they're starting to deal with heart behaviors and they're starting to deal with motives and desires of the heart and affections. And now this gets more complicated to deal with. And we're still stuck at the first stage, just telling them, get up, stay in your room, play your toys, clean your room, etc. We have to adapt with it. My point is we have to grow up in shepherding our kids as they are maturing into adulthood. Here are the ways that we can provoke our kids. And that is that we don't have consistency in our disciplining or instructing. So that the first way is, that we don't hold a consistent line. We are constantly changing, both in discipline and instruction, so that we have an expectation, but we haven't instructed on it. We haven't brought clarity. That's where we lead to exasperation. Or we're not consistent. Like yesterday, you can get away with it, but today we are holding the line, and it's constantly changing. It's that inconsistency which would lead to this provoking to anger. So this would be, again, a sin of omission, what we are not doing. In this case, not holding clear expectations, clear instructions, clear discipline. Other ways we can provoke is having excessive control. This is that we are too strict, too harsh, too exacting. And this gets, again, extremely frustrating for a child who may not have the same motor skills, the same capabilities as an adult. And so it could be seen particularly in a parent who's micromanaging every little detail. These can get frustrating for kids. Some of the examples of excessive control, is, a parent get down to the very details, how to hold your fork, how to cut the food, how many bites you should cut your food into, how many bites you should take. You're just in every little detail you're explaining to the kid or demanding a measure for the kid. This can be excessive control and create frustration. Stop right there. Comments or questions about what that could look like? No? All right. The other areas that this could happen or things that could take place is we can exasperate when we begin to elevate preferences above biblical principles. If it be my preference for a certain volume level to be around the house, oftentimes my preference is not regarded when it comes to family time around the house. The kids, obviously, in their exuberance of life, well exceed my preference level. And at times I have to work hard to say, you know what, this is simply a preference on my part. And I have to overlook such things. At other times I have to recognize, no, we're trying to have a conversation. I do need them to bring it down to a level that we can actually have conversations. So I balance that out to make sure that preferences are not being elevated to the levels of biblical principle, that preferences are shapeable, evaluated according to the need of the moment, and aren't treated at the same way as thus saith the Lord. Like it becomes this divine practice of godliness that if a personal preference was kept. And these are, again, the rights we have as a parent to say, look, I provide the home. Certainly my preferences get to rule here. But there's an awareness of time that when those preferences go against God's design, we don't want to bring confusion to that. We should at least be able to conduct ourselves in such a way that preferences aren't at the same level of authority as biblical principles are. So ideally, we would send our kids to bed at a certain time. If that was overshot, okay, that's fine. It's a preference, and we're desiring for our practice of discipline. But if we had an extended time out at a friend's house and they were out later, it's not the end of a world for us. It's not the same thing as breaking a divine law. So the point is, our kids can become overwhelmed, they can become exasperated, losing hope, or provoked to anger when we're not making a clear distinction between the personal preferences and the actual biblical principles. So that's part of an assessment. And the way you would evaluate that is, what passage of Scripture would I go to be able to defend this desire, this preference, this thing here? If it's a principle or a preference, what passages would I go to? And then the second question to that is, okay, I found my passages. Would good, godly people in my church agree that passage speaks to that passage, to that issue in that way? Am I using some, a hermeneutic that allows me to make some wild connections that aren't there? But if I can certainly point to the Scriptures and demonstrate, here's the principles laid out, and that can withstand the tests of scrutiny from others, then I know it's not preference here, it's principle, and that's what we're being guided by. Comments or questions about that? Yeah, Megan?
Would you say that there's times when, like for instance, if I'm cooking dinner, people are everywhere and I'm like, get out of the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily based on a biblical principle, it's my preference in the moment, but
I don't know, it could be. Like, I can make a biblical case for a dinner time principle for this reason. Usually you're working on a stove. Usually there's hot items there. You're working with knives and other things, and there's chaos moving around. I would violate the law of love, where I'm called to protect my neighbor from danger. If they come running in and running around and are jumping in, it's like, no, these are dangerous things happening here, and for your safety and my sanity, but more your safety, you need to stay out. Because, so it would be assessment there. If I saw, a fire, and I've said to my wife, get the kids out of the kitchen because there are fires and, you are boiling water and all these other things that could happen, that's what the law of the parapet in the Old Testament was all about, that I had an obligation to protect my neighbor from hurting themselves on my property. Well, it would be carrying over into the kitchen as well. If I was doing work in the kitchen that had, items that could harm, and I would need to pay attention, I wouldn't want those distractions. So yes, it'd be okay in those cases. Now, if it was just simply, mom was getting in her safe space in the kitchen and doing dishes, well, probably harder to make the case at that point, right? So looking at the environment and the situation, you can make a righteous case to uphold that principle.
never okay to just say, I have a preference, therefore I'm telling you what to do?
I'd say this, that it's well within your right as a parent. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. The parent has the authority and right to uphold those things. What you want to be careful of is just making sure that preference at that time is not ruling or elevated to the level of scriptural authority so that it's causing confusion. Certainly, it's not wrong for a parent to say, look, I just wanted to be quiet from home to church, and, that's the way it is today. And you have the right as a parent to do that. My greater concern is the pattern and practice of life that says that my preferences are, God spoke to me and told me this is what's going on. That's where I think you're going to have concern. Yeah. Is that clear or helpful there, thinking through that? So yes, certainly the parent, the commands of kids, obey your parents in the Lord. You have that ultimate authority as a parent, because for many levels. I mean, when my kids don't like decisions I make, which is normal because I'm a dad and kids don't like decisions I make, I remind them, well, look what I do for you. Not only do I provide for you a house to live in and a family to be a part of and a peaceful environment to be in and the clothes you have and the food you have and the car you drive in, on and on. You should just demonstrate gratitude and yield to my will. Just simply because of the gratitude, but much more because God commanded you. This is what you ought to do. Now, as a father, while all that I could appeal to that, I don't want to go to that well very often. But I will go to it if I need to, for the sake of whatever is happening in the moment. But I don't want it to be the habit. So. Why? Because there might be a day where I really need to go to it, and I want to know our kids say, yeah, you're right, Dad. All right, any other questions or comments in regards to this preferences versus principles and what that might look like? Yeah.
Do you think there's a way in which you take that preference that plays into whether that would be creating a level of exasperation? Like if you're just telling your kids to get out, then you're not being gracious and loving when you're communicating that boundary.
Yeah.
But if it's communicated as, I want to keep you safe when I'm working with things in the kitchen right now, or it's been a long day and I need some quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Just communicating that wouldn't direct exasperation.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's communicated.
Yeah, there might be ways in which we could help our kids understand more of the picture. The way I would look at it is when they're younger, they don't need a lot. I keep it simple. As they get older, I give them more details based on what they can handle. So if they're getting older, they can understand the concepts, I would give them more accordingly. But yes, again, as the Proverbs say, a soft answer turns away wrath. So that when we can give gentle, clear explanation, it's helpful. Yeah, Jason.
I would say sometimes moments that require a quick, decisive, in sometimes a loud tone, and then you can circle back and explain, like, this is why I was the way I was.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can be, sinful and we would apologize, but like,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's just, hey, look, I need you to move quickly because of this. They don't need to know that at the moment.
Yeah.
You can tell them that.
Yeah, you can. So let's bring up the scenario. What if you had to speak firmly and it produced a kind of despair in the kids? Would that be wrong? A kid was about to run to the street or about to reach up and touch the fire, and you sharply rebuked him there and removed him out of the kitchen. And now they're in this despair of, I wanted to touch that pot, and had no clue about the dangers ahead, but now they're losing hope and the world is ending. How would we handle that? Well, we would, yes, they don't need an answer in the moment. In the moment, their safety is most important. You can circle back and have those discussions. And one thing I would want to bring out in all of this is our objective isn't to avoid difficulties. Our objective is to work through those difficulties in a God-honoring way, and not to add to them or expound on them. I mean, we live in a fallen world. I would hope that we're walking in righteousness and these things are avoided, but it isn't always going to happen. I'm more concerned about when the difficulties come, do we respond to them in such a way that demonstrates godliness? So if I was wrong, go back and correct. If I could be misunderstood, I'll go back and clarify. If I don't need it, to clarify those things, it's just simply, this is a time you have to obey. I encourage my kids, this is the time, trust me, this is good. But I speak at a tone that's gentle, I speak at a tone that's seeking clarity, I seek to communicate in such a way that shows that they can trust, and that I have their best interest in mind, we love them. But I'm not at the sense of avoiding conflict at all costs. That's not the matter. I'm at the matter of be righteous in your responses. And when you've gone too far in a direction, don't perpetuate it. Seek to stop it quickly and get back to responding uprightly. So just because the kid immediately responded in anger or despair doesn't mean you did something wrong there, is the point. All right. A couple of things that we could do to provoke laziness ourselves, and this comes out a lot. We just don't work hard enough to communicate or hard enough to bear a burden ourselves. We're either tired, we pushed off something for too long and now we have to quickly do it, and so we're not, we're careless in our responses. Any of these things could add to the difficulty. We want to make sure that we're not, on our part, everything we can do to make sure laziness isn't getting in the way. Fear also drives us. Again, fear if I don't do this, or my kids are going to be lost, or fear of their responses, or, it could even be fear of what other people will think of you. What are people going to think about my parenting? What are my in-laws going to think about my parenting? On and on. These fears are going to, to rage up. What will the pastors think of our parenting if this happens? These fears get in the way, and we want to make sure that they aren't leading us in our parenting. I mean, as I've said before, oftentimes parents are driven by the fear of what are other parents going to think of me if they see this behavior in the church or abroad. And we can't be living under that kind of fear shepherding our kids. All right, other areas that we add to by not creating boundaries for our kids, we add to these difficulties when we don't create limits for them. I mean, it's the old adage, if you give your kid an inch, they take a mile. There's just, it's funny. It even happened today. I had said to my son, we'll watch this particular movie on this date. First thing I got home, he saw my car pulled in. He had already set up the TV. Everything was ready to go. I'm like, okay, I did say on this day. I didn't exactly say at this particular time, but we're in the window right now. You're right about that. But there's that assessment. You've said this, therefore this is what it means, and their interpretation. So all this to say is we have to be clear on limitations. If you're one of the families that allows your kids to do video games or something, or watch TV or something, and you say you could do that, before you know it, it's like, how in the world did you spend 3 hours there? We've never let you spend that much time. It's, a half hour you get, and now you've gone beyond. I think a parent errs by not setting clear limitations. And then in those lack of limitations, starts to compound problems. So if we're not setting limitations on expectations on how much time they use media, how much time they should be playing, how much time they should be doing their work, we're going to end up creating problems down the line. So that's an area of difficulty. I would even say this, parents, as your kids are growing, they are learning to manage, both their diet, they're learning to manage their hygiene, they're learning to manage the sleep they need. And if you're not providing a structured environment for those things, they're going to miss it, It's like our boys they have an allergic reaction to brushing their teeth. We're like, you can't do that. You have to, we have to work through teaching them that. Same thing with sleep. Every kid in the world seems to be like, bedtime is midnight or beyond, if it's up to them. And we're having to set clear expectations. This is what bedtime is and what it looks like. Parents who aren't watching those clear boundaries are going to end up finding difficulties down the road, and maybe even, compound problems. What happens in a child when he starts to lack sleep? Well, they are easily irritable. They are tired, which means it's difficult to work, which means it's going to look like laziness, and they might just be tired. They're going to be emotionally a roller coaster, up and down. And it's like, well, all of a sudden, just a lack of sleep turned into an emotionally unstable train wreck. And I would say in many cases, parents are frustrated by that, and you're going, well, but did you carefully guard, how they were to conduct themselves and sleep, etc. All right, questions or comments about that? Our time is going so fast. All right, so here's the remaining details here in regards to what we do. So those are the areas of what we fail to do that causes anger, exasperation. What we do that cause it oftentimes is angry ourselves. That is, we are just either blowing up, we are and there might be many expressions of what anger would look like. The easy ones to spot are the person who is just high volume, red in the face, temper, might even be throwing things. That's easy to spot. But there are other ways that anger might be going. The person who just won't stop talking, they're just going to talk the other person into the ground. And the way it's easily identified is that, one, they don't stop talking, but two, they keep saying the same thing over and over again. And it just, as if I say this for the 45th time in this last 7.5 minutes, you're finally going to get it. And it's like, you're driven by anger there. You're not driven by concern for the kid. So we have to watch those expressions of anger. It might even just be bitterness in the heart that this child is making me work so hard and I'm tired of it. And so there's just a bitterness that comes out. We have to watch for, make sure that it is not happening in our own heart. It could just be irritability whenever we're asked to do something. So we have to look and make sure that we're not adding that to the problem. Another way we can provoke and cause anger, just be exaggerating. We can exaggerate the situation, exaggerate our you never clean your room. There's always a mess. You never brush your teeth. You never do these things. You're always doing this. You're exaggerating, which produces a hopelessness. Dad or mom don't see the good things I'm doing. And if dad and mom don't see the good things I'm doing, there's no hope to continue on. And this is where, again, I'd say we should be working on the other side of being very gracious with our speech, building up, edifying, encouraging. At minimum, letting Philippians 4 dominate us in regards to our speech and practice. When Paul said to the Philippians that, verse 8, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. Just setting that tone in the home, and even that tone in difficult times is helpful. There have been plenty of times when our kids, even at a very early age, when they have been, in one of those moods where they just wanted to demonstrate how loud they could get, in their screaming or whatever, that, I would take those times not to respond to what they were doing, but to redirect them to think about other things while we were working, so that we would be talking about future goals, future plans, future opportunities, so that they were getting their thoughts out of the difficulty of what they were in and directing it to something that would be good, lovely, true. So we want to make sure as we're communicating, we're not exaggerating things, we're not speaking beyond, we're disarming it and speaking truthfully. Another area or way that we could provoke our kids are trying to live vicariously through our kids. It's like, all right, I was the straight D student, so I'm going to make sure that my kid's a straight A student. I was the B team of the basketball team, so I'm going to make sure that my kid's the A team of the basketball team. So I'm going to live through them, and my success is going to be lived out through their success. Well, again, that kind of selfish ambition in your own heart played out through your kids is going to create difficulties. And this can come out in a lot of different ways, and just warn you that if you have a series of mistakes you've made in life that you're burdened by, and you're thinking, I'm going to make sure my kid doesn't make these same mistakes, you're going to have to think carefully how you instruct your child. It's like, well, I chose the wrong spouse, so I'm going to make sure my kid doesn't pick the wrong spouse. I'm going to try to correct it. And I know that's awkward to say with your spouse in the room, but if you're thinking that, the danger is trying to live through your kid that they would make the better decisions and work through, and it would cause them despair and or anger in that response. All right, thoughts or comments about these ways we provoke? Dave?
Sometimes we're adding too much pressure on our kids when we tell them that we want them to be better than we are, or to grow closer to the Lord, and things of that nature.
Yeah, so the question is, do we add too much pressure on our kids when we tell them I want you to be better than me? Yeah, it's like, here's where I was, but I want you to be better. I think that it can become an idol, where our idolatry of that we would think God should work in you without suffering, and I don't want you to suffer, though I had to suffer through these things. I would say in those situations, I've never thought, I want my kids to be better. I just knew they would be because of the context of God's work, if He was working, because I was in a pagan context beforehand. But I always think, particularly as I'm interacting with my kids, I want to help you receive fullness of joy in your walk with the Lord without stumbling in any way. You have the fullness of joy, and I want you to have the confidence that you're walking in the will of God. The only way you can do that is to know His Word and to righteously walk in it. And so that's what I think. I'm telling my kid, I want you to experience a near, close relationship with the Lord. That's my desire. And sin is going to get in the way of that. And it's my job to point out where those sins are at. And that's what's keeping you from having a vital love for Christ. So if I believe that vital union with Christ will lead ultimately to a rich life, a blessed life. And so that's where my faith comes in. I have to believe that them walking upright is the best thing for them. So that's my desire. You gonna add? EJ? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, what I've seen a lot is parents will say to their kids, I want you to have it better than I have. Not
Yeah.
be better necessarily.
Yeah.
Have it better. They end up pushing their kids too hard to go to college and get all the fancy degrees. And it's not
Are you rebuking me right here for my own kid? No. No. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Once he gets his second doctorate, we'll get to it. Yeah. No, it's those are things that we have to watch for in our hearts, subtle idols that creep in, as parents. I do desire to be able to give to my child the best that I can, but I have to recognize I can only give within the supply that the Lord gives. And so I can't be irresponsible. I can't be idolatrous in any way, and so that's what we guard. I let the Lord in His providence limit. But as a parent, I try to demonstrate generosity. I try to demonstrate grace, mercy. I try to demonstrate also self-control and restraint, so they get to see all those things. Because we could err heavily on either side. I could be the parent of just tight discipline, self-control, living a very, trimmed up life. Or I can err on the complete other side, all grace, all lavished mercies, all just rewards. It's somewhere in the middle is a faithful walk. So it's good to desire the best for our kids, but I would always, in my mind, think the best for my kids is their walk with Christ. Everything else is an outflow of that. And so that's always, for me, the primary focus. All right, questions or comments? That's ultimately why, as we planted the church and got involved, our kids came along and were involved in everything to be a part of, that they grew up in the church, serving in the church. They serve even in the summers. We have VBS and things like that. If they're not in it, they're serving it in some way. It's just demonstrating all the time that church is their life. That's what we want to encourage. All right. Other thoughts or comments there? We do have just 10 minutes left here. So if just any category of parenting or circumstance that you say, hey, I was thinking about this scenario or circumstance, how would you think through it? Now would be the time to ask those questions. Yeah.
We've run into an issue with disciplining one of ours, and she just doesn't seem to understand it. That she's receiving discipline for being disobedient.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're kind of, Cheryl and I are kind of lost in what to do.
Yeah. Well, I would say early on, they're not disciplined because they understand it. They're disciplining because you're holding a line. There's sins of omission and sins of commission. Sins we do because we don't even know it. And then there's sins of commission. We know the line. We're just jumping over it. The standard is the standard whether or not we know it or not. So if I drive on the street here, I don't know the speed limit and I pass it, because I didn't know it didn't mean it was not wrong. It was wrong because there was an outside objective standard. So in those cases, I explain to my kids, this is what the standard is. You may not like it, you may not understand why, it doesn't really matter. What matters is this is what the standard is, and this is in your behavior how you crossed it. So if I can articulate what the expectation was, and I can articulate how they crossed it with the events, the discipline, comes clarity. Now, if I'm in a scenario where I wasn't really clear, I'll eat it and say, okay, I wasn't very clear, but now here's the standard and it's very clear, and the next act, crossing that line, there will be a consequence of some kind. So that's what I look at. If I've been clear about the standard, my kids' confusion, struggle, unwillingness to accept that standard doesn't hinder me in holding the line any more than any other law out there that is given. The moral law of God is given. It's written on man's heart. His conscience knows it. But yet God still gave the written law to make clear, certain what was taking place. Romans 2 says that God wrote on our hearts His law. By the time Exodus comes along, Exodus 20, you got the writing of the Ten Commandments. He codifies the law. He didn't have to. It was already there, but He did as an act of grace to make the disobedience evident. So all that to say is work hard at communicating the line, and they will learn pretty clearly, quickly. Yeah. Yeah, A.
So I have a child that likes to lie a lot,
Mm.
and there are times where I know that my child is lying, but
Mhm.
I kind of like an idol to worship peace.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard for me to like confront
Mm-hmm.
that sin.
Mm-hmm.
And also I don't know how to confront that sin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what happens with a child who's regularly lying, and then as a parent, when it's hard to go in and confront that. I say the hardest sins to confront are the secret sins or sins of motive in the heart. Sometimes the lying is one of those because you don't have the details. Motives of the heart are hard to draw out. And I'd say this is where turning to the Word of God and reminding of Scriptures of what you need to do. We are called to speak truth. God is a God of truth, to go down and remind those principles. And then personally, again, as our kids grew up, when they were younger, the more severe consequences came for lying. As they got older, we still held the line as far as consequences, taking away privileges, taking away blessings or future opportunities, finding those pressure points that they like and limiting them because they cross that line. So it's not easy, but it's also one of the things as well I would say to my kids, I will know when God has regenerated you, when you love the truth and you speak truth. They live as a teen and they grow up and they're going to church and they think, I'm a Christian because I've been going to church all this time. Not when you're regularly living in comfortable and lying, you haven't demonstrated. Or if you are, great, you need to help me reconcile how it is that you say you love the Lord and yet you regularly walk in lies here. You got to reconcile that difference and work at it to bring some clarity because I'm not seeing it. So I don't get into the debate of whether or not our kid is a liar or is a believer or not a believer. If they've made a profession, I just draw out the inconsistencies of it and say, you need to reconcile that for me because I'm not seeing it. And then put the burden back on them to do the heart work and talk through. So how do you respond? Go to the Scriptures, remind them of the truth, hold the standard, and make it uncomfortable for them to practice lying. I'd say to my kids all the time, it's my job to make it uncomfortable for you to do evil. That's my job, and I want to be the best at it. So it's my goal to be the best at that. So, yeah.
Growing up, I saw parents do a lot of different styles, like if you could say, with how they were disciplining their kids.
Yeah. So the question was if there were different styles on disciplining growing up, and are there principles on how and where. And yeah, you have the Proverbs that's speaking about though you discipline them, they will not die. I would say ultimately, just by general common sense, the Lord has created the backside with some padding there that they can receive affliction and it does not harm them. For general principles, I would say that our discipline is to be uncomfortable, but not inflicting damage or harm. So yes, they should see that to sin, it hurts, but it doesn't mean crippling. There was a guy in California, a pastor I would say a heretic, who was in a church that actually beat his kids to the point to just physically they couldn't walk, and he felt that that's what he had to do, is being faithful to the Old Testament. It's like, no, you have erred. They are to be corrected. They should learn that the discipline is to transgress, is to be painful, but you wouldn't, have to physically harm. What principles? I mean, as far as styles and other things, I guess more you're asking in regards to some saying we don't spank at all, but we just add other kinds of discipline. Is that what you're talking about in style?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I do believe that corporal punishment, physical punishment, is, what was talked about in the Old Testament. Though you beat him, he does not die. Spare the rod and spoil the child. The Proverbs, do talk about the use of the rod as a corporal punishment for children. It's funny, I was in Africa, and the stick or the rod was for the head. They would have a twig, and a kid was, acting up, and it would be this whack on the head. I was like, that was against my own sensitivities, I could say, to be whacked on the head. And, obviously I grew up, and it was a spanking on the backside when there was a transgression. But I understand the cultural differences may look at that, say, the application of it. And I'm not going to assess one culture above another in that. What I do assess is that principle. There is a physical punishment that dissuades a child from acting out in a particular way and should be applied. What I can identify when it's gone too far, is when it's beginning to inflict blood, broken elements like bones, and even severe bruising. I would say, okay, the application of that physical punishment has gone way too far, and it's into physical abuse at that point. So that's generally what I would point out. Does the Bible point to the allowing of corporal punishment? Yes. But we should not confuse that with the physical abuse, which would manifest, as I said, bleeding, bruising that goes beyond control, or actual breaking of bones or other things. Thoughts or comments about that lovely subject of, yeah.
I think sometimes it can be helpful, especially when you're sort of establishing your routines as a parent and, for young children, is having a specific place and a specific method.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes like a specific number of slots that it's like
Mm-hmm.
you and the child knows what to expect. It's protection from you so that you're not, depending on your mood, choosing all sorts of different methods or your level of frustration that day, or whichever particular child happens to be catching the bad end of it.
Yeah.
And then, if you say, okay, go to whatever, they're like, oh, they
Mm-hmm.
know exactly what's going to happen, but they know the
Yeah.
I think there's some good lessons for them in that, and then also some safe boundaries.
Yeah, there is in that case, it's just the consistency. Setting a consistent expectation of what the consequences are helps the whole matter, helps you, and it helps the child know here's the transgression. And so there have been seasons where my wife has created an if-then chart. If you do this, this is the consequence, and just go down the common behaviors with the common, judgments that would come as a result. That way, we just go to the chart, we look and say, all right, this is what it is. It takes away that those very other factors that could be anger, frustration in the parent, etc. So those are helpful. Yeah.
I'm going to add just a couple thoughts. Two passages that have been helpful for me is mentioned this a few weeks ago. Galatians 6:1. If anyone's caught in trespass, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a rule. If my wife or I is going to spank, we will not do it if we're angry or annoyed or frustrated. We do it in a spirit of gentleness. And so it makes me you need to cool off. I need to cool off. We'll address this in a few minutes. So just correcting in a spirit of gentleness.
Mm-hmm.
You already kind of said it, but Hebrews 12:11 that discipline it seems not to be pleasant but painful.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the definition there is that there has to be a painful element to it, which is difficult because I used to think, well, a quick swat through denim jeans and a diaper, they'll be fine. So, well, no, there's no real punishment there.
Mm-hmm.
But also not going too far the other way, right? So.
Yeah. Just to remind you of a few Proverbs. You have Proverbs 13:24. It says, "He who withholds his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently." So there is a demonstration in the Proverbs, is just wisdom saying that the withholding of the corporal punishment was an act of hatred. It's an act of love to demonstrate to the child that there's a consequence for doing evil. Proverbs 19 and verse 18, probably spoken to more fathers. Proverbs 19:18, "Discipline your son while there is hope," in this phrase, "and do not desire his death." That is the second half to that proverb of, you're disciplining, but you're not doing this out of anger and rage, out of desire, again, for their death. You're disciplining in self-control. Proverbs 23:13 and 14 says, "Do not hold back discipline from the child." Notice, you think, well, discipline might just be correction, or discipline might just be, holding back a consequence. But it says there, "Although you strike him with the rod, he will not die." So the rod there, even in the Proverbs, there isn't just a threat weapon. There is an actual application of it upon the child. Proverbs 23 and verse 14, "You shall strike him with the rod and rescue his soul from Sheol." Back in Proverbs 22 and verse 15, says, "Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, and the rod of discipline will remove it far from him." And the point is, in all these passages, is demonstrating that the scriptures do talk about the application of corporal punishment as a means and motivation to not do evil. And the way I think about it is that the child should recognize that to sin is hard. And I look as a parent, I'm going to make your life uncomfortable when you sin. When they're small, it's a physical pain. Again, it's not one of the things I warn other parents of, it's you don't drive out sin through suffering. It's like, well, they're sinning again. I must not have spanked them hard enough. That's not the point. The point is, when they do evil, they should say, it's uncomfortable, it hurts. That's the connection we're making. That the spanking is there to say, this is uncomfortable to act this way. I don't want this. I want to fight against it. As they get older and they move beyond it, it moves then from the physical, pain that comes from a spanking to the loss of privileges, the loss of responsibilities or opportunities, the loss of graces that would come to them. So that we take back those things or withhold and we show them. And those things become painful. You take away a phone, you take away an opportunity to go hang out with friends, you take away certain privileges. And when your child asks you, can I just have a spanking instead of that, you have taken away something they love. So the point in this is the scriptures had regularly talked about the use of physical suffering as a means of motivating to obedience. And I understand some are anti those things, and in fact, I remember being in college, and one of my professors, C.W. Smith, the late C.W. Smith, who is now in heaven, would say regularly, I never had to spank any of my kids my whole life. Never had to spank them. And we thought, wow, you got angels. That's great. But he, obviously there were other things that he did in his whole life to motivate his kids. I knew his wife. She married actually Tom Pennington, and she's a pastor's wife in Texas. But I never got to ask her if that was actually a benefit or not to her. But I do know that some have that mindset. All I can say is this. I'm certainly, if you said, I'm never going to spank my child, fine. You still have to make it uncomfortable for them to sin. So you want to take away that and you don't want that, that's fine. I'm not going to kick you out of the church in any way, but there should be something else you're doing that demonstrates that it's uncomfortable to sin. And if you're not doing that, you're not helping your child, and you are doing exactly what the Proverbs say, you're not loving your child. So that's what you have to think through and pray that God will give you mercy and wisdom to navigate through those issues. Well, let's go before the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you so much for this time together. Thank you for the ways in which you give us in your word everything we need for life and godliness. And we do pray that as we think through these principles, that we would rest by faith in your word. Now, when we have certain fears of what people would think about us, that we would still, above all else, obey your word, trusting in you that ultimately that our kids coming to saving faith in Christ is the greatest and best thing for them. So may we work to be out of the way. May we be useful agents communicating to our children. May we be active in our love and encouragement for them. And may the love of Christ rule in our homes. It's in his name we pray. Amen.